Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Reality Transformation Gathering, where we are bridging ancient wisdom and modern science to change the world together. This gathering is a 5-day expansive exploration of the recent breakthrough discoveries in the sciences and quantum theory, psychedelic research, and near-death experience studies, as well as profound and time-tested ancient wisdom from shamanic traditions, indigenous cosmologies, and knowledge from far ancient cultures all around the world. I'm Jocelyn Star Feather. I'll be your host and guide for the Reality Transformation Gathering. And today I am truly delighted to be here with Dr. Signe Goldman, MD. Welcome, Signe. Thank you so much for being a part of this event.
Thank you for having me. This is the most exciting containers for me, where we're talking about science and spirituality and that intersection. So I really appreciate you pulling all of these amazing people together to do this.
Yes, yes. Well, thank you for being a part of it. And I am just so excited about this conversation because your work really is such a merging of those two, the science and the spirituality. So this is going to be a wonderful, wonderful conversation. So could you begin by telling us a little bit more about you? Who are you and how did you come to be doing this work that you do now?
Yeah, absolutely. There aren't that many of us. It's a strange combination. I'm a psychiatrist. I am a psychotherapist. And I'm also an expert in the use of psychedelics in mental health treatment. So altered states of consciousness for treating mental health. Um, I run what's called a CAP clinic in Asheville, North Carolina. CAP is a form of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy using ketamine. So ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. So it's often shorthanded as a CAP clinic. So I run that program in my local clinic, and I am the co-founder of a training program that teaches psychotherapists, like Western trained, licensed mental health providers, also physicians and nurses and other sorts of Western trained providers, how to use psychedelics in clinical practice in a sort of Western, kind of mental health context. So I run a training program that certifies people in that or trains people in that. It's called the Living Medicine Institute. Um, and so I'm kind of working at that interface all the time of people coming out of being trained in that Western model and trying to move into, how do I alter someone's consciousness? And what does that even mean? And how is that healing? And how does that fit into the paradigm that we all went to school for, which is quite different. I'm also a certified rites of passage guide through the Rites of Passage Council in Asheville, North Carolina, where one of my teachers, Cater Brown, is also situated, and he's just gonna give him some credit as being one of the influences on me in my own shamanic journey. And I am a shamanic practitioner. And I just want to give a lot of gratitude as I'm introducing myself to all the teachers whose shoulders I've stood in all those lineages. There have been many. And all the sort of helpers, human and non-human helpers, that have got me into this conversation at this point with you. So thank you for inviting me on. I'm looking forward to talking about whatever you have to ask me about.
Yes, yes, beautiful. And I'm realizing I didn't state the topic of this conversation yet, so I just want to say that now. And the topic is, what is it really like combining psychedelic psychotherapy and shamanism in actual clinical practice? And again, this is just such an important conversation for us to have here because this is happening more and more, and these psychedelic assisted therapies are being approved more and more around the world and being shown to be extremely effective. So I would love to begin by if you could tell us a little bit more about what do you see as this interface between what we're calling shamanism and
Yeah.
then this emerging specialty of psychedelic assisted therapy.
Yes. And I appreciate that you phrased it what we're calling shamanism, because I do appreciate that that word itself can be tricky, problematic, and confusing, because it's not clearly defined. I know you and I use it, I think, in a similar way. And so I'll just say that for my own sense, for clarity, I'm going to use that term to refer to forms of healing that have indigenous or long-standing roots in human culture, that are connected with a cosmology that includes a sort of like more than human world, and that have healing traditions associated with them. I'm trained in that world as well, and I think that there are a lot of variety of types of providers or traditions that could kind of come under that umbrella term, and I would hope that our conversation would sort of speak to all of that. So my I live in a world where that worldview is sort of crashing up against the one of science, really, because mental health treatment is a branch of medicine, and medicine is a branch of science. And I'm a psychiatrist and psychotherapist, and we were all trained to use science-based treatments and things that have been studied by science. And now what's happening is we're coming into clinical settings where people are being given experiences and having experiences that don't fit into anything science has the capacity to study. And so science is a bit at a loss. You saw that with recently with I don't know if your audience is aware of the MAPS trials, but some of the biggest research that came out in this really got jammed up at the FDA level with approval just for almost really this reason. Like they don't have a paradigm for how to figure out how to study what's working here.
Mhm.
Um, but the ones that do have the paradigms are those that we have often called the shamanic providers or practitioners. So I find myself often seeing these two things, these two worlds crashing up against each other, and then having to have conversations about it with trainees who are coming in and seeing the same thing. Um, what does it mean that, as you said, psychedelic therapy has been demonstrated to work, right? So what does that mean? It means that we're altering people's reality, their perception of reality, and that is somehow healing. So are we saying then that the altered reality that these that we that the client is experiencing is true, is has truth to it? Um, and what does that mean? What does that mean for this for the rest of the medical community? If that's what we're saying, that's a giant paradigm leap.
Mhm.
Or are we saying it's hallucinatory and it's not real and it's all imagination? But then why is it so healing? Why is it working? And I would say that this it's like trying to put a square peg into a round hole with the way it's actually playing out in training programs and clinics. Because, on an individual level, people like you and I, and many people, probably your audience, are yet, yeah, I can get behind this. And yet, as the systems and the institutions that we live in cannot get behind this.
Mhm.
And so, I think that this is like the place where we're seeing the beginning of the fermentation of something that will have to, that I think will have to kind of change the way our whole society thinks about um, what's real, what's not real, what's legitimate, what's not legitimate. And so yeah, I live in that, and um, I find it fascinating personally. And then for myself, it's been a really meaningful part of my own journey because I had to walk that myself to figure out to get to where I am now. And so it resonates with me on all those levels.
Yeah. Yes, I love these points that you're bringing up. And, there is kind of a sense of ultimate truth about the results, whether it is just in that person's mind and perception or whether it is real in a larger sense, maybe doesn't even matter if they're helped, if they're healed.
Yeah, it
And
doesn't
yeah,
matter. Yeah. Go ahead.
yeah. And from my experiences with plant medicines, I know how real it is, right? And also just from a scientific kind of, standpoint, even if it's not, but it's working, then doesn't that matter more than anything else?
Yes. And I think that's what's happening is that the results are coming out and the science has to grapple with the fact that the results are good. They
Yeah.
really just can't. I mean, this is a train that cannot be stopped in the sense of, the science keeps showing that this is healing and it's working in people's depression or people's struggles with addictions and all these things are their symptom relief is happening. So it is exactly what you said. Whether we define it as real or not real, it obviously works.
Yeah.
Um, where that gets interesting though is that, if you just stop there, great. But what happened, what gets interesting though is when you start saying, well, why is it working? Right? And I know that you have speakers speaking in this symposium about the neuroscience and the neuroplasticity pieces and also the consciousness shifting pieces. And so it opens the door to a lot of very big conversations about the nature of reality that I think a lot of the scientific community is not quite ready to walk through that door yet. But a lot of the people on the ground are very aware that that's the door that, you know, the that's the conversation that's being opened up by the stuff that we're doing on a day-to-day basis just in the clinic.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah. Yeah, such an interesting line of inquiry here that we're opening up. And could you tell us some examples, maybe from the research or from your own experience of how people are helped, just in general, some examples of how people are helped by this kind of therapy?
Yeah, I'll say, well, one thing that's important to name for accuracy is that not everyone experiences a psychedelic session as quote spiritual. And actually, I would really caution anyone who's in your audience who's in this world or getting into this world against labeling it that way for the client. Like, we have plenty of clients that come through and don't experience this as spiritual, and it's none of our business to put that label on there for them. Like, um, I have clients that are interested in it as they're aware of the science on neuroplasticity and they're interested in it as a sort of a window into more flexibility with their thinking. And maybe they're doing traditional types of therapy like internal family systems or EMDR or or CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, and they want their brain just to be in a more flexible state and they're thinking that way and it works for them that way and that is the way they use it as a tool. So it's important to say that because I think one of the harms that is done actually that people may underappreciate in this space is providers accidentally labeling the experience for the client as like this is going to be a spiritual experience or it's all spiritual when it isn't to them. And that's what it is for the client is what it is. And so our job is to just allow the client's experience to be what it authentically is for them. So having named that's a big chunk of people. There's a bigger chunk of people who will spontaneously have what we would roughly call spiritual experiences. I would call them, like speaking to someone like yourself, I would say like shamanic reality experiences. Um, and often these are people who don't self-identify as spiritual people or self-identify as having any particular belief system. So they're often surprised by it. But they're often also very moved by it and affected by it. And so common examples of this are encountering what I would call like a resource, a helper of some kind that they didn't know existed. This could be a ancestor who has passed. It could be a grandmother or great grandmother, for example, or it could be a sense of a helper or guardian. It could be a sense of something divine if they come from a organized religion tradition. Sometimes it's a god or angelic or presence like that that they weren't expecting, or a sense of a blessedness or a sense of like ultimate compassion. And we talk a lot about mystical experiences and peak experiences, and that can happen. And what happens is then the person has to grapple with what if this is true, then all the stories I've been telling myself about my life and my suffering might not be quite the right stories. And so it becomes, again, this term paradigm shifting for them. So that's not uncommon at all. Um, another common example that really overlaps with what I would call as a sort of shamanic framework of thinking is, we have this understanding in psychotherapy of people having parts and different, parts naturally emerge when you're working with people in altered states. And you may find yourself as the therapist talking to a part of the person that they are not consciously aware of, that they shift and they're speaking to some aspect of them that usually lives unconscious to them. Sometimes those parts have deep wisdom and come out and speak to the client. Sometimes these are parts that are traumatized, damaged, or perhaps unhealthy that they have somehow absorbed into their system that you're then working with. So you can see, I know that you have a lot of knowledge here, so you can see where that starts to overlap with the shamanic healing world in ways that are important to name. Because even though that is not your typical session, if you train as a psychedelic assisted psychotherapist with a Western medical background and these things come up, you will be at a loss. Like they don't teach this in therapy school, right? So this is where in our training program we emphasize study all the evidence-based things, all the science for this, but also know that if someone is having this kind of an experience, um, there's skill sets here that need to be stepped into where there is a lot more wisdom and knowledge in shamanic lineages. And so this is where like this sort of practical interface shows up.
Right. Yes. So interesting. So interesting to hear.
It is.
I'm curious too about trauma. I've heard so much about different medicines being really, really supportive in healing trauma. Is there anything you would say about that as an example of how that kind of how that healing happens for those who have maybe PTSD?
Hmm. Yes, we treat, I would actually say more of the clients that we see in our program and that I think my trainees are seeing in their various practices around the country more often are trauma than not. Sometimes they come in identified as having PTSD, and sometimes it's that people that come in identifying as working with depression or addictions, actually what's underneath is trauma. Whether they're aware of that or not, it's often some, so we end up working with that a lot. And so I I think what happens on a psychedelic, if I had to kind of explain it in to the audience, is normally when we are traumatized, which so many of us are, and we're carrying trauma, it means there's like these ingrained patterns in our nervous system that are holding this trauma, and we cannot tolerate that. We can't tolerate what we're holding. So we press it down, or we do various things to cope with kind of pushing it down out of our awareness, or we engage in all kinds of unhealthy ways of trying to manage it or live with it. There's a couple things that happen when you're in a psychedelic altered state that make a difference. One is you all of a sudden see the stuff that you had buried unconscious to yourself, like content that you're not usually aware of becomes visible. It's all of a sudden like your lens widens and you aren't able to hide things from yourself, in the same way. So what as a therapist, what you're seeing is the person can all of a sudden remembers things or has a sense, sees their parts or sees that where the trauma is. And they it's almost like they become the God's eye view, or sometimes we call it like the bird's eye view. They're looking down and they're like, oh, I see all this inner landscape of what my map is of all this stuff. And I didn't even know that was in there. I didn't have that insight. So the first is like the expanded insight. And that's the sort of universal phenomenon with working with psychedelics. Now, the question that I think the audience may then have is like, well, is that good? Because this is really horrifying stuff, right? Do you want to throw them into all this awareness of that? And so the second sort of magical property, if you want to call it, of the psychedelic in these contexts is it buffers the agony of the content. So it's not that you don't feel it. Interestingly, you will re-feel it. You will re-experience the emotional pain, the physical pain. You'll re-experience all the distress. But there's almost an observer part that's watching you experience it. And so there's a kind of a buffering that you don't have in ordinary reality. And the way I often describe it, it's like you are in your trauma. You are seeing it even more clearly than you ever have before, but it doesn't have its claws in you in the same way that it takes you over. You're not taken over by it. There's some part of you, the observer mind part, that is kind of watching yourself do the trauma work. And somehow on the medicine, you can tolerate it more easily. So people will do really intense trauma work that they have not managed to do in ordinary consciousness for years or something. And afterwards they'll say like, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe, that I was able to do all of that." But they will also be okay. They will not be, what is called re-traumatized, right? Now, there's a very important caveat. That is if this is held well and safely and therapeutically. Because it is a truth that individuals who are experimenting with psychedelics on their own or who are going to circles that are not held by therapists or just a lot of psychedelic tourism, for example, like there's a lot of contexts out there, some of these on the underground, where people are becoming re-traumatized. And so I just want to name that. I am speaking to working specifically with a trained trauma therapist, right? And then what happens is what I've described. And so I would say those are the kind of two magical aspects. One, you see more, and the second is you can tolerate it differently for some reason.
Yeah, that's so interesting and profound. Thank you for sharing about that.
And part of, just to speak to this kind of interface with the, shamanic understanding of reality, I think part of what I see people being able to tolerate it better, part of that is a literal buffering of the medicine. But part of it is quite often there's a sense of a resource coming in,
Mm.
like a helper or something that's holding them while they're doing the hard work. Um,
Yeah.
which in my lineage as a shamanic practitioner is a helper, right? And so that happens quite often too.
Yeah. Yeah, and it sounds like the kind of the overall theme here is that paradigm shift moment, that aha moment, of, oh, I can see this in a different way, or I have help I didn't know I had, or I
Yeah.
can I can handle this now because I know something that I didn't know before. That's
Yes.
beautiful.
And I can feel this thing that my whole entire system has been working really hard to not feel for
Mm,
decades. I can feel it and I can experience it, and somehow I can have the resilience to do that.
yeah,
And that, yeah, surprises people.
right, right. Yeah, it's like even that element of the surprise is part of what heals. Because we've gone
Yes.
through life with these
Yeah.
patterns, these traumas and these, depression or whatever it may be, and then all of a sudden we see it a new way. And that's really,
Yes. That's so empowering when that happens. Yeah. Yes, there's a empowering element to this for sure. Because the person now has a different story um for their own story, but they have different agency now. They have sort of, it empowers people because prior, if people with trauma, prior to doing this kind of work, they're sort of suffering under their trauma. You could use victim language, like they're the victim of their trauma, and afterwards they are not. They still have trauma, but they have this agency around how their inner system navigates it, right? And they feel empowered and they feel sort of resourced differently. So it's
yeah,
interesting, it's not like your trauma vanishes and it doesn't exist for you anymore. It's that your relationship with it shifts. Like that's a hard thing that's pretty powerful to watch though, and it makes
yeah,
all the difference.
right, right. Yeah, I can imagine that must be so powerful to see that happening for somebody.
Very, it's powerful and it's humbling. It's humbling because um I would just like to say to your audience that is watching this, especially if you're all interested in this work, like Um, if you do this work really well, you're not doing that much. You're creating a safe therapeutic held container where you're watching the client and some inner healing wisdom or something that the client accesses that is more wise than themselves, whether it be a part of them or a helper, right? We don't know what that is, right? In our world, we have different ways of describing it. Whatever it is, you're watching that happen and you're watching the client almost heal themselves on a psychedelic. And so if you're doing it well, you are not making anything happen as a therapist. And so yes, it's incredibly compelling to watch. It's also very humbling. Like I often am just like filled with mostly like immense gratitude that I'm allowed to be in the room right at all in those moments.
Yeah, right, right. Yes, yes. So another question, a little bit of a different
Mhm.
question here is that, with shamanic cultures, we usually think of working with plant medicines.
Mhm.
And you mentioned that you're working with ketamine. And so can you tell us a little bit about that? How does that come into the picture and how is that important and relevant here?
Yes, there are many traditional lineages around plant medicines, which is what people had. And nowadays we have plant medicines and we also have um, pharmaceuticals that were derived to mimic plant medicines. So ketamine is one that I spoke to. Another one that people often have heard of as MDMA, which is being studied a lot and has a very long history of use in therapeutic work, going back to the 50s, 60s, 70s when it was widely used in psychotherapy. And that's the one that has most recently been through the FDA approval process, or is in that ongoing process. So, and right now, what's happening is ketamine is the one that's legal. MDMA is sort of in the process with the FDA, and then psilocybin, which is magic mushrooms, which is plant-based, is kind of third in line. May end up getting approved even before MDMA. I don't know. We're kind of all watching that come out on the federal level. And most providers, whether you trained in the underground on any other medicine, in clinical practice right now, are all using ketamine because it is legal. It's as simple as that. So I often get asked the question, like, is it the same or is it as good? And the answer is yes, because, and this is something that is many people have many opinions about, but most of those people who have those opinions haven't actually worked a lot with ketamine. So as someone who's worked with plant medicines a lot and all of the things and is coming and also has done a lot of, I come from, because I come from a shamanic lineage world, I've also worked a lot with altered states that aren't induced by substances at all, right? Like we have breath work, we have fasting, we have sonic drivers, right? Like a shamanic drum rhythm. We have all kinds of things that we know alter consciousness, you know. In clinical world and in sort of even medical world, we have hypnosis, right? Or we have all kinds of, we know, you probably know this, we know that there are ceremonial ways to induce altered states in people. You can shift someone's consciousness through ceremony. So, I'm aware that most of the healing has to do with the fact that the person's consciousness is altered at all.
Mhm.
And the work that you can do with psilocybin, which is a plant medicine, or ayahuasca, or the work that you can do with something like MDMA or ketamine or LSD, right? Everyone knows that one. That's chemically derived to try to mimic magic mushrooms, like back in the day. Um, all of that starts to look like the same thing functionally, because what you're doing is you're opening a window to the person being able to see their own unconscious or their own wider, you're basically taking the filters that we have that narrow the way that we see reality. And this is where it gets into, this is actual science based. I think you probably have speakers who can speak to this even in this symposium, but um, we live, like, our brains naturally filter things in a very like restrictive way, and that helps us survive. We see what our brains tell us to see. What all of these things do, all of these psychedelics, but also things like breath work or other kind of these other things I named do, is loosen the filter so that all of a sudden we see all these things more. And it can be overwhelming. We can't live like that. We can't walk through our daily lives on something like LSD and survive. Um, but these are windows that open us up to non-ordinary reality. And there are spiritual traditions or mystical traditions in every faith tradition all over the world of accessing this kind of mystical or spiritual state, right? The Sufis would spin, this,
Mhm.
in that tradition, so on. There's so many examples of that. So I think what we're really talking about at the end of the day is opening a window into non-ordinary reality consciousness. And all of these different substances are really just different keys to open that door. And I think it's the door itself that you're working with. It would be my answer. So right now, on a just really granular, to answer your question on a really practical level, the providers like myself and the people that we are training are using ketamine because it's legal to use, and so you can move it right into a legal um, mental health practice, and so it's happening all over the place. I think that more of us would be doing that with other medicines if we were legally able to, but this is where we are at the time in our culture with regulation.
Yeah,
Mhm.
right, right. Yeah, I love how you explain that. They're all opening the doorway.
Yeah, and it's been my personal experience too, having sort of done a lot of those things I just named.
Mhm.
Um, the more one alters one's state of consciousness, the more one starts to recognize that landscape. Like, okay, I know this place. This is the place I go when I'm altered, and I don't want to overstate that. There are differences between the medicines. They're not identical, but there's a commonality of this is what I am or who I am in an altered state. This is how I navigate it. And part of what I do in my clinical practice is teach the client that. Who are you when you're altered? What is this version of you? What is this landscape? And whether you get to that on ketamine or through breath work, most people who, frequently enough dip into altered states start to know the territory of that what in a way, regardless of what method you used to get to it, I think. So, I'm sure not everyone would agree with that, maybe that languaging, but that's been my experience. Yeah.
Yeah, and this piece about the fact that what we see and sense with our normal five senses is not all that there is, is a really important part of this conversation too, because there is so much more
Yeah.
available to us that we, as we know from a spiritual perspective. And again, maybe the science is not not all completely on board with this, but this is what we're opening the door to is so
Yeah.
much more that we cannot see, the guides, the helpers, the other perspective, maybe more colors, more, sacred geometry, whatever that may be, that we can't normally.
Yeah. And it's really fascinating in clinic because, we're allowed to use ketamine, for example. We're allowed to use it by science because science has approved that it's safe and so on like that. But they don't, science as a whole doesn't have anything to say about the experiences people are having. They just can say the substance itself is safe and here's how you can take it safely. The experiences people are having, there's no paradigm for that for most modern Western Americans, like because we live in this materialist kind of paradigm right now. So that's why I referenced earlier that a lot of times people are surprised by their own experiences and often surprised by let's call it the shamanic nature of those experiences. And I am not anymore surprised when that happens, of course. And it doesn't happen for everyone. But yeah, people are, I think, I think what's happening is the clients in my clinic, my brick and mortar clinic in little Asheville, North Carolina, are having the experiences that the sort of shamans have spoken about for millennia on almost every continent for as far back as we probably know. And our society hasn't quite grappled yet with what that means. But one thing that nobody can get around is that it seems to be healing people. And even the science can has to see that. So here we are.
Yes, right, right. Well, it's a really good place to be. It's a
Super
whole new
fascinating.
view. Yes. And
Like
so,
see where we are in 10 years, right? Who knows? Like I
right,
might have a
that's
different
really
conversation.
exciting to think about.
Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah. Even just 2 or 3 years, I feel is really pretty exciting to think about.
Yeah, it's like an ever-shifting landscape. And that in the context of the ever-shifting landscape of our broader socio-political kind of times that we're living in now, is also something interesting to contemplate. Like there's a lot of dismantling of paradigms and
Yes,
I
right.
just hold that curiosity, you know.
Yeah.
I'm just here as a witness to my little slice of it, but it's
So
it's very
how do you see people generally, in our modern westernized culture receiving this? Are there I guess, are there people that you suggest assisted therapy to and they just want nothing to do with it? Or do you see more people are kind of open to it?
both. Obviously, the people that come into a clinical program like mine are somewhat self-selecting, that they're already interested. What I have seen is an increase in interest, and I attribute that to the media coverage of psychedelics in mental health. There was a huge, like in recent years, there's been a ton of media coverage by, the New York, everyone from the New York Times on down, like a lot of books written, a lot more mainstream media doing interviews like, just the CNN. And so it's like everywhere. So what's happening is people who are desperate, who nothing else has worked for, are being told, hey, this is a new thing that you should try. Or people who are just don't love the idea of being on Prozac or don't just are hearing about this and saying, this is interesting, I'm intrigued. So there is an increase in people sort of self-referring into the work. I am sure, and I know that there's a large segment of society that's uncomfortable with it and is like, that is too weird. I'm not gonna do that. And they're just not self-referring into a program like mine. And I see the same thing with therapists or mental health providers of various kinds wanting to get into this work. There's an increasing number. And the ones that think it's too woo-woo or just too unscientific, I'm probably aren't the ones applying to my training program. So there's a self-selection piece there. But what I can say is that there's an exponential growth in both those populations. And the people who do come in, I referenced this earlier, but we're very careful to not uh not name this as a spiritual therapy because it isn't. We're saying this is psychotherapy. We're using the psychedelic to help create that neuroplasticity and help broaden your lens and all of these things. You may or may not have different types of experiences. That's none of my business. Like it'll be your experience, right? So even those that come in, some of them don't think of it as spiritual or want to, and I actually think that's appropriate. I think they should get to say that. Um, and then some of the people who in that category then get surprised by how spiritual it is, and then some don't. Now, as far as like the acceptance, what I think happens, and I think you'll understand this, is when you have a lived experience of something that is experienced as to you as very real, then you're not going to discount your own lived experience. And so if something magical happens to you, let's just use that word, it's you're going to accept its truth if you are the one that experienced it in a personally real and personally relational way. Um, so there is that. And then I do think that there's a whole segment, like just in the community and in the conversations out there in the professional, there's a whole segment of people who are grappling with some of this and it makes them uncomfortable. There's a discomfort because we like again, we have these two worlds colliding that don't have anything in common. And there's been abuses happen. I mean, there's been negatives that have happened with environments where psychedelics were just thrown around in ways that they shouldn't have been, right? There's that. And so it's not one has to do it carefully. You know, when you're altering someone's reality, you're playing with fire in a way. You can't do this in an incautious way. And so it can be terrifying for people or traumatizing for people if it's not held in specifically in a therapeutic container. So there's also an awareness of that. And so you also have a segment of people being like, whoa, whoa, slow down. This is I'm not safe at all. And there's some truth in that too. So there's a complex landscape going on. And, I would argue that most of where that harm fear comes from is environments where you either haven't had a like adequate therapy training, but also don't have a shamanic lens, right? Because you don't know how to encounter that kind of content when it comes up. And so, people are being thrown into things like that and without help or without a frame of reference. And um,
Right.
so it's a mix, I guess would be would be the fastest answer. It's a mix. Yeah.
It's a whole new frontier, as
Yes.
we were saying. I'm just reflecting as I'm, thinking about everything we've talked about here today that I believe that humans are meant to have these kind of breakthrough experiences at certain times in our lives, like that's what leads many people to a spiritual awakening. And it may have nothing to do with psychedelics. Like for me, my spiritual awakening, for example, had nothing to do with psychedelics, but it was this sudden influx of new information that I had no context for
Yeah.
and changed my entire perspective on reality and how I decided I wanted to live my life going forward.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that I think as humans need those kinds of experiences. There are these awakening moments or these catalyzing moments that are, I mean, for me, that was quite scary at the time. I had no idea what to do with
Yeah.
that information
Well,
and nobody to assist me with it. And it's
yeah.
interesting then that these kinds of therapies, psychedelic assisted therapies, are giving people a safe container to have that kind of experience if maybe it you know hasn't
Hmm.
occurred to them in other ways, or it has and they need support with navigating that, whatever it might be.
Yeah, you raise a really good point. I mean, there is this concept of spiritual emergency, for example, that we're hearing more and more about. And you're correct, it doesn't always happen on psychedelics. It happens with anyone that has what we would call a shamanic awakening out of the blue right? Or it's but psychedelics, the fact that we're starting to bring psychedelics into mental health and all of a sudden psychedelics are being used more openly, um, we are creating more opportunity for that. And that's when your concept of reality is jolted so suddenly with no help in integrating that back into how to function in ordinary reality or how to reconcile the two. That it's like extremely distressing. And people have to like a lot of people sounds like that may have been part of your journey. A lot of people have to like struggle through that and just like figure it out because we don't live in a tribal culture where, there's an understanding of what that is, and there's teachers that help you navigate it. There's mentors, right? Um, And because I live in a world that advocates for the use of psychedelics, I have to take responsibility for the fact that this is one of the risks of putting someone on a psychedelic without the right container wrapped around them. And so I actually am not for sort of recreational legalization of psychedelics, which I think a lot of people surprises a lot of people, because I'm an advocate for psychedelics as a benefiting mental health. But the reason for that is that if you are in a correctly held mental health container, like the type that I teach, you're held before, a lot before preparation phase, it's called, during, but also a lot after
Right.
because it can really shake you up and you're staying with the person in the after stage for a long time, sometimes a very long time. I mean, as you may know, a lot of psychedelic or intense non-ordinary reality experiences, whether they're due to medicines or not, take years to fully integrate or process. And so if you don't have a therapist or someone who really gets that and is kind of wrapping that around you, um, again, you're just putting people out the risk of harm. It's a huge responsibility, and I think maybe I'll take this moment to say, as someone who runs a training program, I think there's a huge interest among therapists in getting into this work. And I would caution you, if you're in this audience, against wanting to get into it for the coolness factor or the interest factor, if you have not done your own work to figure out what the responsibility level is going to be. So,
Right. So important. So, so important.
yeah.
Yeah. And that same thing for anybody, thinking of going to a shamanic medicine ceremony, maybe for the first time, it's so important. And this is a whole other conversation, obviously, but to find the right guides and practitioners and to really,
Yes. And
really,
have ongoing support
Mhm.
in place, not just short term. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Thank you so much, Signe,
Oh,
for
you're
everything
welcome.
you've shared. Is there anything else you want to say that maybe we didn't get to, or that feels important to say, and as a completion statement of what we've talked about?
I guess I would just say maybe just speaking directly to the audience, like those of you who are watching or listening to this, like maybe check in with that part of yourself that drew you to watch this conversation or this whole symposium, this whole conference. Um, like notice that part of you that's drawn to these conversations and these interfaces and send some gratitude to that part, but also maybe a little more curiosity because there is, I think, of course, this is my world, but I think these are the conversations that need to happen, not just locally but also kind of maybe more globally. Like, I really feel like the kinds of things we've been talking about here are relevant for the broader questions about like how we're living as human beings collectively. And so, without saying what that is, because I am nobody's individual wisdom teacher here, I would invite the audience to just have a curiosity, like about that for themselves, and maybe spend some time wondering, because it's there, wherever we're going, it's going to take all of us. Right? So,
Absolutely.
calling out in that way. Yeah.
Yeah, beautiful. Well, thank you. I really can't thank you enough for all that we've explored here. It's so fascinating, really profound. Um,
No, I've loved it. Thank you for inviting me to talk about my favorite stuff.
yeah, absolutely. And I'm grateful to Cater for connecting us as well through
Yes.
other business channels. We got
Yes, Cater
listed
Brown's
in
been
there.
one of my teachers and at Rites of Passage Council and likewise when it's just like hold him up as someone who's shown me lots of ways of leaning into this work that have been helpful.
Mm.
Mm.
He has been a great teacher on my path as well. And he is a speaker in this conference. So everybody go definitely watch
Yes.
Cater Brown's interview as well. It's an amazing interview with a divination included. So
Great, definitely do that. Yeah. And yeah, thank you again. And thank you for all of you for, like I said earlier, showing up for this conversation because this is I don't know I guess I was gonna say this is where the thing it begins, but this is also like there's all these growing places where these conversations are happening, and we have to have these conversations in order to become part of the greater wave of whatever is happening that's bigger than all of us, right? So I'll leave it on that note. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, I like to say this is how we build the radical new world together.
Yes, we have to show up. And you showed up in a big way, Jocelyn, by creating this. I'm showing up, and all of you guys, you're showing up. So we have to show up for these conversations. It's exciting and it's humbling. And so gratitude to each of you.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, that's such a good point. Everybody watching is called here for a reason. I feel that everybody watching the whole conference, there are certain interviews you will be drawn to, and you'll know I
Yeah.
have to watch that one. And it's something really important for you on your journey at this time. So pay attention to those intuitive hits
Yes.
for sure. So if you're
Yeah.
watching this one, there's a reason for it for
It's been
sure.
true for me. Yeah. So.